Hello. In this video, I want to talk about this question. How should we react when bad people die? Now, I don't have extensive notes on this question. I don't have really a pre-planned lecture, just some sort of ideas of what I want to talk about. So this is a little bit more informal. But it's something that I thought was interesting, and something that was sort of, a question that was sort of bouncing around in my head over the past week or two. And I thought it would be a really great opportunity to kind of use this question as a springboard for deepening your understanding of philosophy, of moral theory, and of how philosophers can use moral theory in order to clarify and make sense of a contemporary moral issue. So something that I do in my ethics class that you would do in any ethics class is you not only learn about moral theories, about these sort of abstract ideas about what makes actions right or wrong or good or bad, but you also apply them to important contemporary issues to see how these moral theories can shed light on the way that we understand and analyze these issues. So in most ethics classes, you'll talk about abortion or the death penalty or these really sort of high stakes issues. But sometimes it's just as interesting to talk about these sorts of smaller everyday situations that we encounter that do have moral stakes and that are worth teasing out, I think. So in any case, the purpose of this video, I would say, is threefold. The first is to show how philosophers tease out a question like this. You can see that I've teased it out, which I'll illustrate for you in a second. How philosophers tease out a question in order to see what sorts of sub-questions need to be answered first, in order to define the terms of the question, in order to better understand the question, and then allow us to give more satisfactory, comprehensive, sensible answers. That's the first thing, show how philosophers can tease out a question. The second is to kind of illustrate moral theories. These are sort of the three kind of big moral theories that you would typically discuss in a philosophy course, in an ethics course. There are others that are super interesting, but these just happen to be the three that are most often discussed in the Western canon. I think there's some good reasons for that. But hopefully, through this discussion, you'll get a very basic grasp of what these three theories are about. And then, of course, relatedly, how you can use moral theory to provide clarity and nuance on an otherwise complicated issue. And I think this is really important because it understanding the theoretical perspective for thinking about an issue and bringing that to the fore allows us to communicate better when we talk about an issue, because we often discover that when we're disagreeing, we're coming from completely different frameworks, right? You're maybe defining what's morally good in a different way that I'm defining what's morally good. And if that's the case, then that might explain why we disagree about the particular issue. But you might never discover that unless you're really able to tease out the sort of theoretical foreground for the discussion. So first, how we tease out a question. Second, how we can, what these moral theories are about and how we can apply them. And then the third reason that I'm doing this video is because I'm just interested in this question. It interests me, and I presume it's interesting to you. I kind of don't know exactly what I think about this. It's something I'm still sort of figuring out in my own mind. But it's an interesting question, and I have some ideas, but I would love to hear in the comments what you think and what you have to contribute to this discussion, because this is not going to be in any way comprehensive. This is just the stuff I've been thinking about in the past week and a half, but this maybe could be the springboard for like an ongoing conversation about this question. So the question itself, let's dig into that. Now that you know what this is, the purpose of this video is. And yeah, and I should also say, like, I did say, like, I don't have like extensive notes for this really at all, or really hardly any notes, like just one little note card. So, this is a more casual sort of, I guess, lecture, but the point of it really is to generate a discussion and to kind of illustrate how a philosopher might tease out an issue in kind of real time, because I've thought about it a little bit, but I'm kind of teasing it out right here with you, on the cuff, whatever, right? Okay, so I did put a couple things up here. So I wanted to, the first thing we need to do here is to try to understand this question. And because it's a little more, what I mean by this is a little more than what it says, right? It says, how should we react when bad people die? Okay, first thing, what do we mean by should? Well, we're talking morally. We're talking morally speaking. How should we react? And I'm not going to give you like a decisive answer on this question because I don't know what it is. But I'll give you not even a decisive answer from each of these perspectives, but the types of things that we would want to consider from each of these theoretical perspectives, or what someone might say who's a utilitarian who ascribes to the moral theory of utilitarianism, or someone who ascribes to the theory of Kantian Deontology, who's a Kantian, what they might say. And there could be, a number of different reactions from these perspectives, but we can sort of consider several, right? And then someone who is a virtue ethicist, who believes that virtue ethics helps us best understand morality, what they might say. Okay, so that's what we mean by should. How should we react? Okay, when we're talking about reacting, when we react to somebody dying, or when we react to anything, you can't control your initial reaction to something. So it doesn't really make sense to say, how should you react if you can't control that reaction, right? So what we're talking about are the types of reactions that we can control, right? Maybe not, maybe something happens and you have like you stub your toe and you say, ouch. You can't control that. You said ouch, it's sort of a reflex, but then you can control what you do after, right? So not the immediate reactions, but the types of reactions that we can control. And those are the only things that matter morally anyway. Nobody can be praised or blamed morally for something that they can't control. So our reactions, in terms of the ones that we can control, and do we mean our private reactions, our internal reactions? You might say that to some extent we can control those. Maybe not the initial, ow, I stubbed my toe, but I can choose to continue thinking about my stubbed toe and obsess over it, or maybe I can try to distract myself, right? Same thing if a bad person dies. Maybe initially I feel catharsis, or oh, that's something I should have put here. Maybe initially I sort of feel catharsis, but then I sort of check myself and I say, this is very sad, actually. I shouldn't be happy about this person dying. And I kind of, put myself in my own place, I guess. So yeah, privately, there's private reactions, and those could be morally relevant. But mainly what I want to focus on is public reactions, right? One of the reasons this issue's kind of, I think, especially contemporary, I guess, I don't know if that's the right way to say that, is that we didn't used to, before social media, before everybody had an online presence, we didn't really have the opportunity to react publicly to every single thing that happened in the world, right? We didn't have now it's sort of like, some people, older people mainly use social media just like strictly to keep in touch with people, say happy birthday. But a lot of people in my age group, millennials, and some older people, and younger, maybe you're Gen X, Gen Alpha, or whatever, right? We use social media to express our views on things and to share our political ideals, or, to fundraise. We use social media for all sorts of things. And what that means is that we have the ability to project our voice anytime something happens, right? And people that actually publish things, that have blogs, right? we have the ability to react publicly, not in a way that just our friends and family see those reactions, but like even relative strangers or acquaintances, right? So that's mainly what I'm concerned with this question, or what I'm interested in, is how should we react publicly? And I'm largely thinking of social media, but it doesn't have to be confined to that. And then there's this other aspect of this, is reacting to others' reactions. So let's say somebody that I consider to be a bad person, they die, and I feel like catharsis again, and I express this publicly, and somebody else says, how dare you feel that way? That was a person with a life, and you're just mocking them, or you're trampling all over their grave. You have no right to feel that way, right? So that's a reaction. How do we react then? What do we comment on the post that the person makes about the person who has died, right? Or do we have a right to react in, when should we weigh in on somebody else's reactions, and how should we weigh in, right? Okay, so how should we, that's what I mean by react. Morally, how do we react publicly to bad people dying? But then, of course, there's this question of, in order to do that, we need to know who the bad people are, right? How do we know who a bad person is? Is a bad person just somebody who does bad things, who causes harm? What if somebody spends their whole life, murdering people? They're a mass murderer, a serial killer. And then at the end of their life, they come to regret it, and they feel terrible, and they cry, and they, I don't know, do something amazing. They do something amazing with their, their last moments or whatever. Or they just have regret and feel sadness and whatever. Are they a bad person? What about somebody who does good things throughout their life, right? What about somebody who builds homes for homeless people, and then at the end of their life they commit some horrible act, or you find out that they that they sexually assaulted somebody, and that happens a lot too. So that, that's another thing here, is when we're thinking about bad people, this sort of like when you find out that a person, I guess the sort of like when somebody is canceled for doing something. That's another aspect of this that I hadn't even really thought about, that now I'm thinking about, right? That maybe isn't a famous person or something, right? So there's this question of how do we determine if someone's a bad person in the first place? And then in terms of who we're talking about, who I'm interested in, public figures, right? That's who I mainly want to talk about. Although, like, as I just brought up, it could be somebody who's not like super famous, but somebody who is known in some friend group or some small circle that you find out that they assaulted somebody, or that they were abusive in some way. Should they be shunned and ostracized? Should they be forgiven? I mean, that's a whole nother can of worms that I wasn't even really thinking about. Mainly, I was thinking about public figures, in particular, figures who are kind of politically divisive, right? So really, this is the question. Morally, how should we publicly react when people that we consider to be bad people die, that are sort of public figures? So now we've kind of teased it out. On the bottom here, I've written some different types of reactions. These are just, there's probably a billion more. These are the ones that popped into my head, right? In blue, I wrote reactions that are generally positive. Positive in terms of the bad person dies and you're feeling some kind of good way about it, or expressing that this was a good thing in some way. Celebration, just, yeah, hell yeah, this person died. I'm happy about it. I'm going to tell everybody, right? And that can kind of come in different flavors. There could be sort of just full-throated, hell yeah, this person's dead. Great, awesome. Screw them, right? There can be an almost sort of spiteful celebration, like sort of a sort of spite, and that kind of comes with a kind of catharsis. There can be mockery. There can be just less intense, just a sort of like relieved. You can just be like, this is a good thing. I'm relieved, right? And then there's endorsement. And what I mean by endorsement is not only are you glad that they died, but you have a sort of forward-looking belief that that should happen more often. And so for this one, I'll give you an example of who I was thinking about here. I was thinking about Luigi Mangione, the young man who murdered the CEO, Brian Johnson, of United Healthcare in 2024. A lot of mixed reactions to this, right? Because a lot of people see the healthcare industry as incredibly corrupt, immoral, even evil, right? People, thousands of, I mean, I don't know the numbers, but surely thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people die either from not having insurance or having their insurance claims rejected, or, you know, or at the least, people's lives are made much, much more difficult. They go into incredible debt, right? So a lot of people see the insurance companies as horrible. And even though this guy murdered the CEO of this company, they think not only was that good, but that more people should do that, right? That's something that we should endorse and embrace, right? So the death of that guy, Brian Johnson, not only is it like, yay, I'm celebrating, what a jackass, I'm relieved, but also like, I want this to happen more, because you could celebrate and say it's good that he died, but maybe we shouldn't embrace vigilante justice, right? So that's what I mean by endorsement. In the center here, in black, I see these as completely neutral reactions. There's silence, you know, just maybe you feel some kind of way, but publicly you don't say anything. There's indifference, like saying publicly, I don't care. There's hesitation, saying, I don't know what to feel about this exactly. Those are three sort of, I see as kind of neutral possibilities. To give an example of this and why these sorts of, you know, neutral reactions might be the most appropriate. I was talking with a friend about this and how I was going to make this video, and I was asking, how do you feel about, in particular, about Lindsey Graham dying? That was sort of what inspired this video. Lindsey Graham died on the 11th, July 11th, which was 11 days ago. Today's the 22nd. And he was a Republican senator who a lot of people believe was really, really harmful in a lot of ways to the world, and that his death was a good thing, right? And what my friend said was, well, Scott died. How do you feel about that? And I looked at him kind of like, what do you mean, Scott? Scott, I don't know. Who's Scott who? He said, I don't know. Somebody named Scott probably died. And I said, okay, I see what you're getting at here. Like, we don't know these people. Why should we react in any kind of way? Why should we grieve or mourn them, right? Indifference might be the most honest response, right? Indifference or just not saying anything, right? Because I don't care about Scott. I didn't know Scott. Well, I didn't know Lindsey Graham either, right? Okay. And then in the red are these sorts of, I would say, negative reactions, which are more commonplace when somebody dies, expected, socially, typically more appropriate. That doesn't mean morally they're appropriate, but they're, you know, the most common sorts of reactions, right? You mourn somebody that's died, right? For me, when a public figure that, not politically particularly divisive, but a public figure that I remember mourning, not deeply, but was Robin Williams, a comedian and actor. When he died, I don't know, it was maybe 15 years ago. I really liked Robin Williams. I liked his movies. I just kind of connected with him a lot. And he also committed suicide, which I found particularly sad for somebody that made so many people smile and laugh. And that, you know, was, I to some small degree, I didn't cry, but I did mourn a little bit, right? So mourning. So yeah, point being, you can mourn people that are public figures, even if you don't know them. Contrary to what I just said about Scott. Praise, saying, you know, eulogizing the person, saying they were wonderful, et cetera, et cetera. Regret, just sort of saying it's a, you know, a bad thing. And this is, again, more mild, like, because you could say, I thought this person was bad, and I disliked them, but it's still sad that they died, so I have a little bit of regret. I'm not going to praise them, I'm not going to mourn them, but I regret that they have passed. And then I skipped sanctimony. Sanctimony is in particular, I'm thinking of reacting to others' reactions when I think of sanctimony. And I already sort of gave an example of that. If somebody, let's say somebody died and you, let's say you are, let's say, you know, let's say Donald Trump dies, okay? And let's say you are not a fan of Donald Trump and you are really happy about this. He is widely hated person, to be perfectly honest, but he's also a widely loved person. There are many people who really think he's going to save America and is a great person, right? Well, let's say he dies and you are just all over the internet. Donald Trump has died. I'm super, super, super happy. And you have a relative who's a Trump supporter, and they might say, like, I know you disagreed with him, but this is really inappropriate that you are celebrating so much. They're being sort of sanctimonious, right? Now, on the surface, that might make sense, but I think you can kind of call that into question as well, right? Okay, so that's the kind of sort of outline of what I'm doing here. I'm going to stop the video, and then we're going to dig into these three perspectives. The first moral theory that I want to address in terms of teasing out this question is utilitarianism. So I have an hour and 44-minute video on utilitarianism, and I actually plan on doing another one. So if you don't understand it, you can watch that video, and I would be honored if you did. But I don't expect you to, because this is supposed to be kind of a shorter video here. So I'll give you the most bare bones synopsis of what utilitarianism is. It's a moral theory, tells us what makes actions right or wrong. The right actions for a utilitarian are those that create the most good, right? Utilitarians only care about the consequences of our actions. Our consequences should create the greatest good for the greatest number. In other words, make the most people happy as much as possible. And on the flip side of that, of course, eliminate pain as much as possible for everybody who's affected by a given action. So the utilitarians only care about consequences, and they care about everybody that is affected. Okay, so if we're asking this question, how should we react when bad people die? We're trying to answer it as a utilitarian. That's the perspective we're in right now, the utilitarian perspective. What are we going to think about? What kinds of questions are we going to ask? Well, we're going to concentrate on the effects of our reaction. That's the only thing that really matters. The effects of our reaction. And all the people that are affected. Off the top of my head, there's one person who's not going to be affected by how we react to a bad person dying. As far as we know, dead people do not feel anything and do not care what you say or think about them, whether it's good or bad. So there's at least one person who is not even going to enter into our calculation if we're a utilitarian, and that's going to be the person who has died. It doesn't matter what we say about the bad person in terms of them. We don't owe, they can't feel anything, so we can't harm them, so it doesn't really matter in terms of their interest. They don't have any interest, right? So that's the first thing to note. And this seems obvious, but actually when we talk about Kant, there might be a level of respect that we owe to the dead. Utilitarians they don't care about respect for the dead for the dead's sake, but they might care about respect for the dead in terms of their close friends and family. So the utilitarian is going to care that if you say bad things, if you mock somebody who's died publicly, that might hurt the people who loved that person, their friends and family, or even just their supporters, right? So like, my example earlier, Trump dies and somebody is celebrating online saying, thank God, right? He was a bad person. Well, maybe that hurts all of the, people that you're friends with that liked Donald Trump, right? Maybe they feel like you're mocking them, right? Maybe you alienate them in some way, right? Maybe that, ends up becoming really divisive. Maybe mocking and celebrating causes a further political rift A lot of people think that we as a society, we're already so divided about politics, and it's because we don't have any sort of like civility anymore. There's no civility, right? People can't just, maybe if you don't like Donald Trump, you should be silent if he dies, or be indifferent, right? Right? So, that's one thing to consider is the effects in terms of, not in terms of the person who's died, but in terms of how your reaction kind of comes across, the way that, it causes other people to feel who knew the person, friends and family, or just liked the person. Okay, that's one thing to consider. Another thing the utilitarian is going to consider is the world going to be better if that person is gone, right? I mean, if you're somebody who believes that Trump is doing irreparable damage in the world, if you're somebody who believes that he shouldn't be dropping bombs in Iran and killing innocent civilians, you might think him dying is going to save a lot of lives. Or if you believe him, ramping up these ICE deportations, pulling people off the streets, often without due process, people who haven't committed any crimes besides just being here without documentation, right? You might think, well, Trump dying is actually a great thing for immigrants, for marginalized people of all stripes, right? So that's something you might think that. You might not. You might have a totally different perspective. You might think that Trump's died and now we're going to be soft on immigration. Now, all of this ignores the fact that if Trump were to die, like J.D. Vance would be president, and who's to say that he wouldn't be even more hard on immigration, even more pro-war and so on. So, you can go deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole in terms of the effects there. And you could go, that's what political analysis is, right? But that is something you would want to ask is, will the world be a better place? The whole thing that I think I already mentioned this, it sort of inspired this question and me thinking about this, was Lindsey Graham passing away. And Lindsey Graham was 71 years old. He was a Republican senator who had been in Congress since like 1995. So for a long time, and massive war hawk, right? Not only war hawk, not only somebody who supported war, right? And I think there are people that support war that don't want innocent people to die, but he's somebody who, by his own admission, wanted innocent people to die, right? And that's not me being partisan. That's stuff that he said. There is, just to kind of plug, an article that I thought was really good by Nathan J. Robinson in a publication called Current Affairs you can find online. It is called Why Mourn Lindsey Graham and Not His Victims by Nathan J. Robinson. Only reason I bring it up is because Robinson outlines some of the horrific things that Lindsey Graham has said and advocated for. And it's not just that he believed, for example, if we're talking about, Israel and Palestine, there was the October 7th attack on Israel by Hamas. And then there was Israel's response for the past few years, where Israel has killed at least, the lowest estimate is 70,000 people in Gaza. Many of them are innocent civilians. It's a very sad thing. And regardless of what you think about that, you should, I think, morally believe that it's very sad and regrettable that all of those innocent people have died. Well, Lindsey Graham, right after October 7th, said that we should flatten Gaza. He said we should level the place. We flattened Berlin. We flattened Tokyo. Were we wrong to drop an atomic bomb to end the Japanese reign of terror? Talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, he didn't see these as regrettable events, these nuclear bombs that we dropped. He saw them as good things, right? And this isn't the only instance of this, right? He's repeatedly, over and over again, advocated for really hardline pro-war stances and a complete disregard for civilian lives. What's my point? Okay, my point is there are strong reasons to believe that the world is a safer and better place without somebody like that in it. So we're talking about utilitarianism, right? Will the world be better if the person dies, right? You could say, talking about that CEO, right, of United Healthcare, that guy dying could just, this isn't like me saying it should happen, but could be a good thing. I mean, a lot of CEOs of health insurance companies started, walking around with bodyguards all the time, and the stock prices of United Healthcare apparently were cut in half right after that, right? So, that sort of thing could cause healthcare policy to change if these CEOs fear for their lives, right? So utilitarian cares about that, but that's really still not the question we're asking, right? Just to rewind a little bit. That question is it a good thing that they died? But what does that mean about how we should react? If it's good that the person died, should we say so? Should we say it's good that this person died? And I think there could be a value in that, in sort of cutting through our instinct, right? We want to be, socially accepted. We don't want to commit a faux pas. We don't want everyone thinking that we're horrible people if we, if we do something besides mourning and praising these people. But maybe there's a real value in, to be frank, cutting through the bullshit, right? Cutting through the bullshit and saying things for what they are, right? Allowing ourselves to be honest. That might really have a lot of utilitarian value. That might be an appropriate reaction. So, expressing catharsis and relief and allowing others to express that catharsis and relief. Even if you yourself want to remain silent and you don't want to say, well, I don't know Lindsey Graham, I don't want to say anything bad about him. If there's somebody whose family member was killed by a bomb in Gaza, I don't think you would, I think it would be very strange to scold them for that, right? If you saw somebody from Gaza posting on X, thank God Lindsey Graham is dead. Sanctimony seems to be pretty inappropriate there, right? There might be value in calling a spade from a utilitarian perspective. So then we could go even further and we could say, is there value then in spite? Is there value in, actually having a kind of vengeful sort of attitude? And that sort of, the sort of catharsis that comes along with that. There could be something mobilizing about that, something that kind of brings people together, something that, emboldens people, something that kind of, I don't know, allows people to feel like a sense of solidarity with one another. So there might be something to be said for that. Now, again, this isn't the utilitarian verdict. These are all just considerations, because the utilitarian might also say, we shouldn't embrace spite, because if somebody that you politically disagree with, if you celebrate and have spite towards them, and then somebody that you politically disagree with dies, somebody else feels spite towards them, right? Does that then create this sort of vicious cycle of hatred and divisiveness? And maybe that's not good. Maybe that's not what we want as a society, right? The same thing thinking about Brian Johnson, the CEO who was killed, right? You might say, from a utilitarian perspective, this is something we should endorse, right? We want these CEOs to be afraid. We want to force their hand so that people can get the healthcare that they need. They shouldn't be able to just run around in the world making millions and millions of dollars and, completely ripping people off for their insulin while they go into debt and can't pay their rent and starve, right? So you might say that's a good thing, but you also could take another tack, right? You could say, well, of course, do we want vigilantes running around? Would that be good from a utilitarian perspective? What would the effects of that be? if everybody could just take justice into their own hands. If I said, my boss isn't paying me enough money, so I'm going to kill him so that bosses, feel more afraid and they have to pay their employees more. Well, then you just get people, killing anyone that they feel is treating them unjustly, right? So it could lead to a sort of breakdown of the social order, a breakdown of law and order, there could be a kind of slippery slope if we're going to endorse that sort of thing. So, you might say, okay, this CEO dying is a good thing on its own, but we don't really want that to happen. We don't really want people to go around killing anyone that they feel is bad or is harming the world, right? There's a place for the rule of law, perhaps. So, again, not a verdict, but these are all sorts of things the utilitarian would consider. And I'm gonna stop utilitarianism there because you can sort of see the sorts of rabbit holes you could go down. And all I'm really doing here is peering into the rabbit hole, and maybe you'll peer into it with me. Okay, so what about Kantian deontology? If we are a Kantian deontologist, well, what is Kant? What is Kant's thing? Kant, this is the exact opposite of utilitarianism. Kant thought that the morality of an action had absolutely nothing to do with the consequences. The consequences are irrelevant to the morality of the action. And there's good reasons. This seems odd, but there are some good reasons to think this, right? So when somebody lies, for example, let's say you have a partner who cheats on you and they don't tell you about it because they want to spare your feelings, and you never find out about it. Have they done something wrong to you? Have they done something immoral by lying? Most of us would say that they have, right? Even if the effects there is no noticeable effect on anybody. Everybody's happier for it because they get to get away with it. You never find out, you get to live a happy life, right? So the point is, this is meant to illustrate that, like my little example there is meant to illustrate that we don't think the consequences are the only things that matters, right? We also need to treat people with dignity. Kant thinks that we should always treat people with dignity. These are the two big, what I see as the two biggest ideas from Kant. One is that the right action never treats somebody as a means to an end. Because if you treat somebody as a means to an end, you're violating their dignity. Even if that end is good, even if the thing that you want to achieve is a good thing, you can't use people to get there. A doctor can't cut up one innocent patient and distribute their organs to 5 other patients who need those organs. It doesn't matter if the effect is better, right? There are certain things that you can't do to people. You can't use them as a means to an end, even if that end is a good thing, right? That's why you can't lie. You can't lie because you're using somebody as a means to get what you want. They can't consent when you lie to them, right? You're taking away their ability to consent. You're depriving them of their autonomy, and you're robbing them of their dignity. So you always have to treat people with humanity. The other big idea in Kant is that whatever you do, if you can't imagine a world in which everybody acts like you do, then the thing that you're doing is wrong. If you can't universalize your action, imagine that it's a universal law of nature, that everybody acts like you, then you can't justify what you're doing, and then it's morally wrong. So those are what I see as the two big ideas in Kant. So Kant is going to ask then, straightforwardly, do we violate anybody's dignity? In our reaction, do we violate anybody's dignity? And I think there's a number of ways to answer this. In the first case, well, I mentioned with utilitarianism that the person who has died, their interests don't matter because they don't have any interests. But for Kant, actually, that person still, perhaps, I think he would say this, right? That they still have dignity. You can still violate their dignity even if they can't feel it. You can still treat them as a means to an end. That somebody, and this is in line with our intuitions, that even if the dead person, the person who's died, doesn't, know about what you're saying about them, you still owe them some kind of respect. This whole idea of respect for the dead, right? So it doesn't really matter if you think the person is a bad person. They have a humanity for Kant. Everybody possesses this innate humanity. And by mocking somebody, by celebrating their death, you violate their dignity. You use them as a means to your own enjoyment, your own entertainment, your own catharsis. So you have a sort of, again, you can't control how you react privately, but you have a sort of responsibility to rein in those emotions and to always remember that a person has a kind of dignity that can't be violated. And I don't see why, for Kant, I mean, I don't know what he really said about the dead, but I don't see why a dead person wouldn't have that dignity as well. Right, and then like to this question of universalizing your actions. So, if somebody that you disagree with politically dies, you think that they were a bad person, and then you celebrate it and you feel happy about it, could you universalize that reaction? In the sense, would the world be a good place? Would it be a place that would make sense if everybody reacted the way that you do when somebody that they politically disagree with dies? So if you're going to do that, you have to accept that when somebody you like politically, when they die, you'd have to say it's good that other people are reacting with spite and mockery and celebration. And I think most people don't really want that. So I'm going to use an example here that I'm actually pretty wary to use, even though I can't think of another one. But he's really not a political figure. He was just a regular person who was unfortunately murdered by the police. This is George Floyd, who in 2020 was, Derek Chauvin, a police officer. George Floyd was alleged to have been using a counterfeit bill. He was a black man, and Derek Chauvin put his knee on him and, he choked him out and he died, right? And it's not political for me to say that Chauvin murdered him, I don't think, because he was convicted of murder, right? And everybody saw it. It was on camera. And it sparked, not only national, but global protests, Black Lives Matter protests against police brutality. And it was, a very sad thing that this man was murdered. Well, a lot of people on the right were pretty quick to point out that George Floyd wasn't a saint, right? That he had several charges already, including aggravated assault and armed robbery. Now, I don't really completely see, or I don't see at all how this could possibly justify him being murdered. But they saw this guy as I also will say, I don't think I was hesitant to use this example because I don't think it's really a fair comparison to compare someone like that who was raised in like deep poverty, dealing with structural racism and all of that. Also, he apparently had completely turned over a new leaf at later points in his life. Anyways, I'm not interested in judging George Floyd, right? I don't think it's a fair comparison to compare him to someone like Lindsey Graham. But maybe that's just my political bias, right? Right? If I'm going to sit and laugh and say Lindsey Graham was a bad person, he made the world worse off, and therefore I'm going to laugh at him and spite him and everything else, right? I then can't, it would seem, you might say that I can't really complain when someone like George Floyd dies and people on the right say, well, he was a criminal, he committed robbery, he was a drug dealer, all of these things. I can't then get mad at those people, right? Because I have expressed spite and mockery at someone that, I thought was a bad person. So I have to accept that when other people do it as well. If I'm not willing to accept that, if I can't universalize my action, if I can't say that this is the way that everyone should behave, then what I'm doing from a Kantian perspective is morally wrong. Now again, I think the issue could be a lot more complicated than this. Because what about praising somebody. I mean, when Lindsey Graham died, there were all these Democratic senators who said, well, I disagreed with him, but I disagreed with him on some issues, but he had a sharp wit and he was a public servant and all of these things. And to me, that seems like kind of disingenuous, right? That seems like baloney, right? I don't know how else to say it, right? So would that be a good world too, right? Where everybody sort of lies and praises people that they know to have been bad people, right? Or that they know to have been at least people that really harmed the world. That seems like not a good world either. That seems like a lie. And for Kant, lying is the epitome of immorality, right? By lying in that way, you're sort of using the public as a means to enhance your own image, enhance your own self-image. Or you're using the death of this person, right? In some ways, that's praising somebody who you thought to be a deeply bad person is another kind of form of disrespect of that person, right? It's a sort of disingenuous sort of flattery. So you might say that would be inappropriate too. So maybe he would say you should be indifferent. You should say nothing, right? You shouldn't use this dead person to advance your political agenda one way or the other. That might be the reaction that he would propose. And then in terms of like the sanctimony thing of, if somebody in Gaza is celebrating that Lindsey Graham died, I don't really care what you think about Lindsey Graham. If that person has watched their family member be killed by U.S. bomb or Israeli bombs, at the behest of people like Lindsey Graham, even if I was someone who thought that was necessary, I wouldn't have any right to scold that person, right? So that sort of, I think that sort of sanctimony could be another way of like violating somebody's dignity or using them as a sort of means to your own satisfaction. I don't know. I'm not sure. Again, this video is just we're just peering into the rabbit hole. So if you have other thoughts on the Kantian reaction, I would love to hear them. But in any case, that's what we'd be concerned with. The last perspective here is virtue ethics. Virtue ethicists, okay, so virtue ethics is not necessarily a theory about right and wrong action. Instead, virtue ethicists focus on character, on what it means to be a good or a bad person. We're not concerned when we're thinking so utilitarianism and deontology both answer this question of what makes actions right or wrong. Utilitarianism says actions are right if they create the best consequences. Deontology says actions are right if you can universalize them or if they don't violate anybody's dignity. You don't use people as means to an end. Virtue ethics doesn't say, because virtue ethics originally came out of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle and Plato, right? And those guys, there wasn't really this concept of actions being easily categorized into right or wrong. Actions could be just or courageous or cowardly, right? Actions can express different virtues and vices that individuals may have. And so there isn't like one answer. There isn't like an algorithm that you can use to figure out the right or wrong action. You can't just look at the consequences or something like that. Instead, virtue ethicists say what matters is being a virtuous person, living a flourishing life. And I think a kind of result of that is that the virtuous person, the more virtuous you are, the better you're able to know what to do in any situation. So the right action emanates not from like a calculation, but emanates from just the possession of the virtue. If you're courageous, if you're just, if you're temperate, if you're compassionate, then you'll be able to perform actions that are morally better because you have those qualities. Okay, so there's a lot more I could say about virtue ethics. It's a little more complicated than these other two theories. And it's, in fact, the one that I find the most compelling. But let's just say for now that what we're concerned with is what type of people we are. What our actions, do our actions contribute to our virtuosity or virtuousness, or do they make us more vicious? Do they encourage vices? So, okay, so what will a virtue ethicist ask? Somebody who embraces virtue ethics, what will they ask about this question? Well, they're asked, what virtues or vices do our actions express? So, if I celebrate the death of Lindsey Graham, what does that say about me? Does it mean that I am a callous, cold-hearted person? Or if I praise Lindsey Graham and mourn him, does that mean I'm a superficial person? Does that mean I'm a cold and callous person? If you're somebody, I don't know why I said it like somebody, if you're somebody who doesn't really engage with politics and doesn't know much about this guy, and you hear that a senator died and, well, he was in the Air Force and he had a Bronze Star, all true things, right? You might think, oh, that's very sad for a moment, and rest in peace, Lindsey Graham. Well, that doesn't really say something good about you, I don't think. That's not a good quality. You don't get to be sanctimonious towards people that feel relief or catharsis about this person dying. That's actually kind of suggesting that you're sort of just somebody who's disengaged, somebody who's shallow, right? Whereas, celebrating, that might suggest that you're somebody who's deeply invested in this sort of thing, that you're somebody who is, I don't know what sort of virtue we would put there, but it might be a virtuous thing, might not, might be a vice to celebrate, to mock somebody or to gloat in it, right? That could be a sort of, obviously that could be a bad thing. But what about indifference and silence? I think there's a virtue in humility, right? Somebody who doesn't really know a lot about somebody that's died, right? They might want to jump on the bandwagon. Maybe all their friends are saying like, oh my God, this horrible politician died, or like, hell yeah, we killed the CEO of United Healthcare, like revolution, right? You might have an urge, if you see all your friends doing that on social media, you might have an urge to like jump in and jump on the bandwagon. But maybe you really haven't thought it through, right? And if you do that, if you kind of jump on the bandwagon there, that I think that expresses some kind of vice. That expresses a kind of thoughtlessness. That expresses a kind of rashness. I don't know exactly what the word there would be. A kind of cowardice, a kind of laziness, kind of apathy, a kind of superficiality, maybe, right? So hesitation, silence, thinking it through, those might be more appropriate reactions in that situation. They're also just, in terms of endorsing and celebrating violence, I think it's something that, I'm not saying it couldn't ever be justified, but I think it's something that we should be very wary of at the very least, right? So, I mean, like, there's all sorts of things that you could think and feel, and the person who's the virtue ethicist would want to say, what type of person does that make you? What does it say about you if you mock somebody who's died, even if you think they're a bad person? What does it say about you if you celebrate? Let's take one more example here. Charlie Kirk, right? Young man, younger than me when he died last year. And he was pretty far right conservative who would go to college campuses, and he would ask, he would debate people on issues, and he was very pro-life, almost like a Christian nationalist. He said some things that were could be construed as hate speech. Many have construed as hate speech as things that are racist, xenophobic, but he was 32 or something, right? And he was shot in the neck for essentially saying things that people didn't like, right? Now, like, I mean, I don't want to minimize the harm that he might have caused, like, the sort of power that he wielded, the way that he, the way that he sort of changed the culture on college campuses, the way that he, I don't know, like, there's all sorts of, again, like utilitarian ways of kind of evaluating his presence and his life. But regardless, this was a young man who was shot violently, who was shot in the neck. And I think to celebrate that and to mock that, again, the purpose here isn't for me to be morally preachy. Maybe I'm getting too preachy here, right? Because I think that there's a value in saying Charlie Kirk was a bad person, if that's how you feel, right? That could be a good thing. But I just think what I'm saying is you should be careful, right? We should be careful. There's a value in being a careful person. But maybe there's a disvalue in being too careful, right? Maybe that's a vice as well. Maybe being too disengaged is a kind of cowardice. Maybe a virtue ethicist would say you shouldn't be disengaged, right? You should actually, if you don't feel some sort of catharsis about these awful, evil, warmongering, whatever, people dying, then that shows a total lack of engagement, a lack of, a sort of disinterest in the things that are going on, or a lack of, depth in terms of internalizing the stakes that are involved in some of these figures living or dying. So I think I'm gonna cut it off there, because really, like I said, we're just peering into the rabbit hole. But I want to end with, there are two things I wanted to read, and they're just things to think about. The first is from that Nathan J. Robinson article about Lindsey Graham. I want to read the last paragraph of this. I think you should go read the article and see what you think about it as well. The last paragraph is this: I don't have any qualms about speaking ill of the dead. They're dead, and we only owe respect to the feelings of the living. We have to be clear about the record. Stalin is dead. Do we not speak ill of him? No. After a person dies, their legacy has to be assessed. And if they lived an appalling life successfully advocating mass murder, as South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham did, well, that's their legacy and it should be discussed. But even if you hold the silly principle that we should hold our tongues and not be honest about who people were, you don't have to adopt the senatorial principle of cordiality, whereby everyone is honored as a great and noble statesman, even if they were a homicidal prick. It's okay to simply not say anything at all. I have no comment on the death of Lindsey Graham is a perfectly legitimate thing to say, and follows the principle, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. But personally, I think what ought to be said is far closer to what Grandview University professor Thomas Leacock wrote of Graham. This is what this guy said. I don't give a fuck that Graham used to be friends with Democratic senators. He was a bloodthirsty bastard who cheered the killing of Muslims and sold his soul to the fascists to be able to push it more effectively. I don't care about any other part of him. His choices caused mass death. That's it. So you kind of get two perspectives there, right? If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Or what Nathan J. Robinson suggests is that much more hardline sort of embrace of his death, celebration of it, spite. The other thing I want to read was that I thought was interesting, the letter that Luigi Mangione left when he killed the CEO of United Healthcare. He said this: to the feds, I'll keep this short because I do respect what you do for our country. To save you a lengthy investigation, I state plainly that I wasn't working with anyone. This was fairly trivial. Some elementary social engineering, basic CAD, a lot of patience. The spiral notebook, if present, has some straggling notes and to-do lists that illuminate the gist of it. My tech is pretty locked down because I work in engineering, so probably not much info there. I do apologize for any strife or traumas, but it had to be done. Frankly, these parasites simply had it coming. A reminder, the US has the #1 most expensive healthcare system in the world, yet we rank roughly number 42 in life expectancy. United is the largest company in the US by market cap, behind only Apple, Google, Walmart. It has grown and grown, but has our life expectancy? No. The reality is these, indecipherable, have simply gotten too powerful, and they continue to abuse our country for immense profit because the American public has allowed them to get away with it. Obviously, the problem is more complex, but I do not have space, and frankly, I do not pretend to be the most qualified person to lay out the full argument. But many have illuminated the corruption and greed decades ago, and the problems simply remain. It is not an issue of awareness at this point, but clearly power games at play. Evidently, I am the first to face it with such brutal honesty. Yeah. So, just some things to think about. Again, thank you for sticking with me for this. This was a little haphazard. I didn't have extensive notes. It's just more of an exploration. I don't intend to endorse any particular view here, but just to encourage you to think through issues and to illustrate how it is that moral theory can sort of illuminate aspects of an issue that we may not have considered and draw out in more clear terms the reasoning process that we may be using, that others may be using, and I think finally to allow us to communicate and talk about issues like this better. So, thank you.